Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, upgrading windows to help curb appeal and keep homes efficient. More at callmosby.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Being a collector is not easy. You might need shelving space for baseball cards or spend time watering each and every one of your plants. You may be challenged when you realize that Beanie Babies just aren't going to pay for your retirement. Now, it's different when you are a collector like the Missouri Historical Society, which has been collecting things since its founding in the 1860s. You wind up with a lot of amazing things, and a new rotating exhibit at the Missouri History Museum is giving visitors a chance to see artifacts that have never been seen publicly. But before we talk about that new exhibit, there's also some news to address. Earlier this month, the Missouri Historical Society announced that the organization had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in cuts from the federal government, which canceled grant money that had been approved before the ongoing budget cuts made by the Trump administration. These cuts haven't just affected the Historical Society. Grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, or NEH, supported organizations like the Missouri Botanical Garden and St. Louis's Holocaust Museum. Now that support is gone. Yesterday, Jody Sowell, CEO and president of the Missouri Historical Society, sat down with producer Danny Wysentowski. Danny began by asking Jody about finding out that the government had canceled a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
We lost about $150,000 from NEH. This is money that had already been approved, in this case for collections care and storage. So much of the money was going to go to improving our collection storage and expanding the capabilities for our textile collection. That textile collection is a nationally and really world-renowned collection, one of the largest textile collections in the country. We can certainly talk about that in a minute. But yes, got notification that even though that had been approved, that the money was going to be canceled. Probably about a week later, we got a similar letter from the Institute of Museum and Library Services that a $100,000 grant that they had, or $100,000 remaining in a grant that they had approved, was also going to be terminated. That for digitization of our photography collection.
And when you say approved, can you talk about that process? Once that's approved, are you just presuming that this is going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens in many of these cases is, you apply for a grant, and we all have had some grants approved and some not. That's part of the process. But these were grants that were approved. But what oftentimes happens is you do the work and then you file for reimbursement. So we are in a good spot in that some of this work hadn't begun, but some of the museums that are being affected, this is work that they already did, that they already spent money on because it was approved. Now that they're asking for reimbursement, they're being told, no, all these grants have been canceled.
So this announcement that you made, that was on April 4th, I believe it was several days later, where that agency sent termination notices, the National Endowment for the Humanities, that is, sent termination notices to 65% of its employees. How did you get this news? Was it someone who was monitoring the grant? Was it someone who you've been working with who is now fired? What was that like, and what was your reaction?
Well, we got an official letter from both NEH and IMLS, that's the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So we got official termination letters. But well before that, on museum listservs and National Humanities listservs, people were talking about museums across the country saying, oh, we just got our termination letter. Oh, we just got our termination letter. So we certainly knew it was coming. I think the current numbers are more than 1,200 institutions across the country have been affected. Locally, we know that the Missouri Humanities Council, the Holocaust Museum here in St. Louis have also lost money. So the Missouri Historical Society certainly isn't alone in getting these termination notices. So not surprising, of course, but deeply disappointing, especially because this is money that had already been approved.
You mentioned the Holocaust Museum. They also made an announcement, this week about losing that funding and needing, having used that funding for archival projects. Can you tell us, when it comes to the Missouri Historical Society, what was this funding used for? You've just released these new exhibits that are bringing together a lot of the artifacts you have in storage. You have a lot of items. Does this funding affect how you preserve and present those artifacts?
It makes it harder, certainly. And, we are blessed to be in St. Louis. That is one of the most philanthropic communities in the country. We are also, in our particular case, I don't want to overstate things, at the Missouri Historical Society, these cuts this year represented, or federal funding this year represented about 0.8% of our total budget. Usually it's about 1%. So we are not taking the hit that some institutions will. So I do not want to overstate that. But these were funds going to, for example, protecting and preserving our textile collection. Inside of that textile collection is everything from the clothes that were worn by the founders of St. Louis to the flight suit that Lindbergh wore on his 1927 transatlantic flight to the largest collection of costumes from Katherine Dunham, the matriarch of Black dance. So these are not just items that are important to St. Louis. These are items with national and international significance. The money was partially going to improve those storerooms, to also make more room in those storerooms so that we could continue to collect the history that's being made in St. Louis today.
You said in your announcement that museums and libraries are even more essential in times like this. Could you expand on kind of what that role is, especially at a time where something that was supported by other sources of funding in the federal government are now gone? Does that change the role of museums and places like the Missouri Historical Society?
These cuts don't change the role. They just make the work a little bit harder. The role of museums in this country are to remind people about the inspirational people and moments in the past, to remind them of the challenges we faced in the past and how we've overcome those, to give them the tools from history to help build a better future. Certainly that's the case of history museums. For us in St. Louis, the Missouri Historical Society is committed to sharing the St. Louis story and introducing people to a St. Louis they've never met and building civic pride and civic engagement. Those things don't change because we lost $250,000 from the federal government that had already been approved. It does make that work a little more challenging, but we are committed to the work. We are committed to serving the people of this community. We are committed to telling the St. Louis story, not just locally, but nationally and internationally.
That was Jody Sowell, CEO and President of the Missouri Historical Society. He spoke with producer Danny Wysentowski on Tuesday. Now, I began this part of the show talking about collections and how a new exhibit at the Missouri History Museum is giving visitors a chance to experience dozens of self-contained stories behind its artifacts. So to give us a bit of a tour of this exhibit, I'm here with Ryan Deloach. He is the Teen Programs and Adult Tours Manager at Missouri Historical Society. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So, Ryan, there are many different artifacts on display in the collected exhibit. There's a massive bird hunting rifle, some adorable kids' clothing from the last century, and there's even a piece of pottery that was broken during the Ferguson protests. Now, I understand that until now, only about 2% of the museum's collection was put on display. Why is that?
Yeah, good question. We have so many things in our collection, right? When a lot of people see a museum, they think that the things that are out on display are the things that they have. Well, that's just a small percentage of the things that we have. We have the Library and Research Center, which is not too far from the Missouri History Museum over on Skinker. And there we have over 175,000 3D objects. We have over 1 million photographs. We have documents for days and days and days that you could go through and never get to the bottom of. But a lot of those things are used by researchers, are used by people that are studying history, but much of the public never gets to see those things. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we're really wanting to do with this exhibit is to share more of our collection than we ever have before with the public and get people to engage with these historic objects and photographs and films and things from our collection that can help them connect to St. Louis's story and help them better understand the history of this place.
Mm-hmm. So these particular artifacts that have been chosen, what was it that drove the selection of these specific items?
Well, the curator for this project is Hattie Felton, and she made a lot of difficult choices, right, when it comes to this exhibit. This is a permanent exhibit, so it'll be on display for years and years and years to come. And one of the cool things about this exhibit is that it's not going to be the same next year as it is this year. We're going to kind of rotate things in and out so that these objects have a chance to shine and tell these different stories. And hopefully it gives visitors a reason to come back too, and so that they can experience more of our collection through these yearly rotations that happen there.
And speaking of visitors, I noted what your title is. You are giving teens and adults tours through the museum. Are there certain artifacts that people have paid a little more attention to or just have a lot of questions about?
Yeah, definitely. One of the joys of my job is seeing people engage with this stuff, right, and see what really resonates with them. And sometimes those are the stories that you expect, and sometimes those are unexpected stories, too. One of the artifacts that's kind of right at the beginning of the exhibit, you're walking in and you see this big taxidermied gray wolf. Okay. This isn't what a lot of people expect to find in a history museum, but it has a really interesting story. That wolf's name is Anna. Anna was born in 2001 at the Endangered Wolf Center out in Eureka, so not far from St. Louis City here, and was one of the last Mexican gray wolves. And gave birth to 41 pups that end up repopulating the gray wolf population. So today there's over 250 gray wolves in the wild. Tons of those are Anna's descendants. And that story is directly connected to St. Louis in ways that a lot of people wouldn't expect, right? So I think sometimes when people come into an exhibit, they're looking for things that are pivotal, that they expect. They're looking for Meriwether Lewis's telescope or William Clark's rifle. You can find those things here, but it's also the unexpected stories that often stand out to people where they say, I never knew that, or I never knew that St. Louis was connected to this national or international story.
And you mentioned this telescope. The feel that I've gotten from descriptions of what is in the exhibit, and kids' clothes is one of the things that we've talked about in our promotions for this conversation. The everydayness of objects, is that also part of what motivated the selections?
Yeah, a lot of the selection can tell kind of multi-layered stories, right? We want to tell some of those pivotal stories, but we also want to tell everyday stories. And one of the things that objects can do is they can kind of fill a gap in the historical record, right? And that can be said about kids, right? In the Life of Kids' Clothes, which is a kind of rotating piece in the back of the exhibit, we highlight the stories of kids and the clothes that they wore on these different occasions. We have interactive spaces where you can create your own kind of life-size dolls with different clothing. We have parts where people can share their own photos from when they were a kid and the different things that they were wearing. So kind of trying to make that interactive, but also highlighting this story of kids that might not always make it into the history book. And St. Louis has a huge fashion history, a big history when it comes to the juniors clothing market as well, and helping establish kids' clothes as separate from adults' clothes.
I see.
And so we're really trying to lean into that in that section of the exhibit.
Yeah. The final thing, just to get people interested in coming to look at what is there, also has to do with kids, but what was in their mouths. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is one of the smallest artifacts that's in this exhibit, but it's a baby tooth. And there's a lot of St. Louisans still that have stories that say, I also donated my baby tooth when I was a kid to this scientific study known as the Baby Tooth Survey. And this survey collected baby teeth from kids all over St. Louis and all over the country to try to make links between health impacts in kids and above-ground nuclear testing that was happening by the U.S. government. And so there are a lot of grassroots activists and scientists that work together, and through the work that they did with these baby teeth and studying this baby teeth, it eventually ends up with John F. Kennedy signing above-ground nuclear test ban treaty. So it's another story that's a St. Louis story that has national and international implications and shows the role that everyday people have in making that type of change.
How much time should people set aside to go through this exhibit?
You know, I've been through it probably a dozen times myself, and I still feel like there are things that I'm gravitating to and that I'm seeing that I didn't notice the first time around. So I would say when you come the first time, give yourself an hour or two to explore, but don't just make it something that you come to once, right?
Yeah.
The things in there are going to be changing as well. So come back and see it, and I think you'll find something new each time you're there.
Ryan Deloach is the Teen Programs and Adult Tours Manager at the Missouri Historical Society. The exhibit collected is open now and free at the Missouri History Museum. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today.
All right, thanks for having me.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.